Hi, everyone. Welcome to another mini lecture. This one's focused on global trade, international economic organizations. This is a volatile week and a volatile time to be presenting on this type of on this type of topic. And obviously, things are changing by the day. Just yesterday, the cost of the barrel of oil actually became negative. People were actually giving money away for the contracts on a barrel of oil. If you've made it out at all, you've seen the price of gas plummet over the last month. Um, International trade is changing all the time. President Trump just yesterday, which was Tuesday, declared that they're going to ban immigration. There are huge implications to that in terms of trade, commodities, just the flow of human resources as well. So, obviously, a lot going on this particular topic. And it's possible that by the time you watch this, some of what I say is going to be irrelevant or maybe more relevant. Who knows? But wanted to kind of go over some of the big points with this, talk a little bit about them, and spend some time kind of hitting on some key elements as it relates to global trade and international economic organizations. So, first of all, just identifying the two major organizations that we talk about a lot, the World Bank and the International Monetary Fund. So, the World Bank and the IMF. World Bank is primarily focused, all of these organizations were created right after World War II, or actually right towards the end of World War II, 1944. So it was actually created right before the Allied victory. So it was in preparation for a very new world, a new world in which many new countries would have economic and political independence for the first time, but may need a lot of money to develop. Therefore, these organizations were there to loan incredible amounts of money to these new countries under the conditions that they would repay those debts and go through some sort of um, economic refurbishing or economic overhaul in their own country to ensure that they had the structures necessary to be productive economy. And that is a lot of code for basically being free market capitalists. Okay, so that was really the focus, was reducing tariffs, privatizing, opening up to foreign investment, not nationalizing your resources. Those were all really critical elements to countries receiving these loans from the World Bank. Like I said, they're providing loans to countries at a very, very, very reduced interest rate, okay, than what they could get from state lenders. So, from what they could get from private banks, what they could get from other countries who might be willing to loan them considerable amounts of money. So, just extremely low interest rates. Okay, think of it as, you know, going to your bank for a loan versus going to your parents for a loan. Hopefully, hopefully your parents don't make you pay it back. But if they do, it's probably at a pretty reduced rate and much better terms than a bank saying you got to pay me back within 30 days of taking this, or you have to start payments within 30 days, and you have a 15%, 15% interest rate for the next, 3 years on the loan. So, whatever the case might be, the World Bank is able to provide those rates at a much, much reduced rate. Okay. There's also a lot of preconditions, and that is a strong element of all of these international economic organizations was this element of preconditionality. We talked about conditionality when we discussed the European Union, how countries had to jump through certain hoops in order to become members of the European Union. Similarly, countries wanting to receive World Bank loans historically have had to jump through these hoops. They need to have fiscal discipline. They need to broaden their tax base. Okay, so you need to have a tax base that is encapsulating all of society. So you need to be taxing lower and even middle income families. It just cannot be taxing at the top or taxing at the bottom. It's got to be taxing kind of the entire society. And then privatization, deregulation, a lack of nationalization, and so forth. Okay, so that was really the focus of the World Bank. The IMF was much more focused on fixing exchange rates, and it's much more now focused on the balance of payments regarding debt. So making sure that countries that are fulfilling debt obligation are doing so responsibly, making sure countries are not defaulting on debt, potentially in some cases restructuring debt agreements so that countries are not defaulting, but to ensure that there is a continuous flow of money. Why is this important? Think back to the very beginning of the semester when we talked about what were some of the causes as for the outbreak of World War II, or the Great Depression, I should say, which, well, I'm not going to make that connection right now. But one of the elements of this was Germany stopped repaying their war debts, right? They decided to stop paying England and France for war debts. And what did that do? All of a sudden, all of these things came to a screeching halt. Because if they're not paying their war debts, then Britain and France are not able to repay the United States banks that loaned them money during the war. And the banks now are not able, because they don't have any more money, they were loaning the money to Germany to repay the war debts in the first place. So all of that came crashing down. So we need to constantly have this cycle of debt payment taking place so that financial institutions are able to remain relevant and that countries don't plunge themselves into a depression. Obviously, you can have a global pandemic come along and that might do it for you because there are certain elements of this that are outside of their control. So what are the pros and cons of some of the, I guess, developments of the World Bank, the IMF over these last 60, 70 years? Well, the pros, I think, from an objective standpoint, is you've seen a dramatic reduction in global poverty. The amount of people living on $1 a day or even $2 a day has declined precipitously. The percentage of the population living on those totals has declined precipitously. This is a good thing, okay? So that extreme global poverty is starting to be eradicated. They've continued to loan to countries affected by poverty. So, whether or not countries have been able to pull themselves out, those loans have been able to continue at very favorable rates to those countries. So, that's a really good situation for them because presumably, if they were trying to get those loans to kickstart their economy from other sources, those rates would be going up a lot more, and probably the amount of money being loaned would be going down, actually. And then the preconditions, as I mentioned here, allow for the World Bank and IMF to feel confident in repayment. When you have a free market, when everybody's on the same economic system, it gives the bankers, gives the creditors a lot more ease of mind, gives them a lot more peace of mind to go, they're going to be able to repay this because they're integrated into the global economy. They're part of this like everyone else. It's not as if they're off doing their own thing, which might adversely affect their ability to repay. What are some of the cons? Well, the cons are that if you peek behind the curtain a little bit as it relates to global poverty, still not that great. Right? You still have 3 billion people, a little less than half of the world, living on less than $2.50 a day. Not great. Certainly an improvement over where it was, but not where we want it to be. Overwhelmingly, we're seeing loans going to middle income states. What does that mean? Think Eastern Europe. That's actually really good. It's like think Eastern Europe. Think emerging countries like Botswana. Think, or even a country like maybe Nigeria. These are the countries that are receiving these loans. In other words, yes, they're not loaning to Canada and the United States and Great Britain and France and Germany, but they're loaning to that next tier down that maybe isn't a sure bet, but is a pretty safe bet that they're going to be able to repay. What they're not doing is you're not seeing those loans being extended at the level that they should be to the countries, what we would call the global south, okay? The countries at the absolute bottom of the economic totem pole. So that's where we've seen some issues there. And then also preconditions are often implemented at a very quick and accelerated rate. We've talked about this before with the opening up of the Soviet Union, perestroika, glasnost, the opening up, the capitalization of a country. If it happens too rapidly, there's not the infrastructure in place, that can have extremely detrimental effects on the economy of that country. right? Again, I told you this at the beginning of the semester. International organizations, it's a lot about infrastructure and institutions. It's not the sexiest topic, but it's so important. If you don't have the infrastructure, if you don't have the institutional capacity to withstand changes, if you don't have the institutions and infrastructure in place to oversee those changes, it's never going to work. It's going to fail. I mean, it's going to fail. Imagine trying to build a house with no foundation. I mean, that's really what you're trying to do. I lived in Florida for a long time. People try to do that there. It's a terrible idea because a hurricane comes along and wipes everything out. So it is what you have to do to get these loans, but the speed with which these countries are doing it is really concerning. So just a couple of charts to kind of give you a sense of this. This one is kind of a little dynamic. I hope it shows up in the video. I think it will. But you can see the percentage of debt repayment as it expands over time, particularly for sub-Saharan Africa from I think it started 2011 and then kind of ticking through future years. You can see it's a significant debt repayment. Over about a 13-year period where it starts off not being a huge percentage of their government revenue. And by 2024, it's 15, it's somewhere between 10 and 15% of your revenue. It's just going to pay back loans, okay? These are countries that are in need of infrastructure, roads, hospitals, schools, healthcare. That's what they need, okay? Internet connections, Wi-Fi, that sort of infrastructure, dams, bridges, electric grids. This is what's needed. And yet now 10 to 15 to 20% of their annual budget is going to repay IMF or World Bank debts. That's a huge problem. It's a huge problem. It's only going to get exacerbated with the pandemic that's going on right now too. So this should give you a sense of how these countries, particularly in the global south, are really being locked into these loans that, again, they're not necessarily bad loans. It's not predatory lending with regards to, there's an early kind of teaser rate. You don't have to worry about, financing or interest rates for the first 3 years, and then everything's backloaded. But it slowly and incrementally becomes a larger and larger part of their budget because they've had to take on so many more loans over the years to stay afloat. So it becomes a quite vicious cycle. This just shows you some of the fastest growing economies, and I show you this to give you a sense of who's probably going to be hit among the hardest by the global pandemic. Fast-growing economies are rarely stable economies, okay? When you look at that list, there are not a lot of, top 20 GDP countries there, right? You don't even see China or India there. India is there. You don't see China there. You don't see some of these other countries. Countries that have very fast economic growth are, in some cases, kind of bubble economies. We saw this back in the 1980s with a lot of technology in Asia, and particularly Japan. But we see this in a lot of other parts of the world, that fast-growing economies, you have very, very uneven growth rates. So they might be up 8% one year, but then they're down to 1% growth the next year, or maybe negative growth the following year. So they don't have the long-term staying power to maintain that 8-9% growth rate, okay? So when something like a pandemic comes along that produces global disruption, these are the economies that are going to get hurt the most because they don't have the underlying infrastructure to support these sort of sudden fluctuations in the market. This goes to show this in a little bit more detail. This is an interesting map, and I'd encourage you, maybe just pause the video and just read the map, because it takes a little bit of time, maybe more than we have to spend on this, to really get a sense of what is it showing. So you see two kind of dimensions. One is the strength of institutions, and the other is their relative wealth, basically. So ideally, you would want to be a dark blue country, because that shows you have high income and strong institutions. That's a great combination, okay? What you don't want to be is a super light pink. That is low income, super weak institutions. That's a bad situation. What you also probably don't want to be is that dark pink even. Those are some of those high-flying economies I just showed you. Yeah, you might have a lot of income. There might be a huge growth rate, but you have really weak institutions. This has all been built upon kind of a foundation of hope more than reality. And you see there, and particularly Nigeria is one of those dark pink countries, and that's really concerning. That a country that has become such an important part of the global food chain is so weak institutionally that they don't have the governmental oversight. They don't have the capacity from an infrastructure standpoint to support these sorts of policies. And also, where does Nigeria get a lot of its funding from? Oil. What is right now going through the basement? Oil. Okay, and I don't say that to make light of it. I have a lot of friends and colleagues whose family members and loved ones are in the oil industry, and I know they're hurting right now. Some of you may have family associated with it. It's not a fun time. And being in higher education, I understand that there's a lot of uncertainty in this sector as well. Our students going to return in the fall? What are courses going to look like? So there's a lot of uncertainty all around. And so, but with these sorts of economics uncertainties, okay, that's happening to everybody. At the very least, though, can you have some strong institutions, because that can kind of bring everything, bolt everything to the floor a little bit better. This is another one that's kind of interesting. I just saw this one today and I wanted to include it in the presentation. But similar to this, kind of you have a couple of different dimensions. One is looking at their level of preparedness for global health pandemic, and the other is their kind of export exposure. So how might they be how might they be exposed to their kind of global trade? Okay, might global trade be adversely affected by this pandemic? What you're seeing is a lot of, the United States, Canada, a lot of the Western European countries are kind of insulating. In other words, yes, they rely on imports all the time, and they rely on exports too, but they have the capability of producing in-house at a much higher rate than some of these other countries where they have to be importing, they have to be exporting to generate revenue. You can see some of the more developed westernized countries are obviously more prepared in terms of the pandemic, but then also less exposed to some of the global risks that's taking place right now. So is China to the rescue? This is kind of the irony in this situation that, of course, we believe that the virus may have originated in China. A lot of people are obviously blaming China, a lot of rhetoric around that. That is not helpful at all. And the reality is that the single biggest benefactor to most African countries over the last 10 to 15 years has been China. And that relationship is not stopping. And so how does the pandemic potentially change this relationship? So what you're seeing is the Chinese government investing huge in local infrastructure, not humanitarian aid traditionally. Now they're making that pivot where they are providing, the N95 masks or respirators. They're trying to provide the sort of health care that might be needed in Africa to a lot of those countries. But they're also still providing those infrastructure and business opportunities. This has long been the bane of the U.S. relationship with China, or the Africa, I should say. That African countries often resent the way in which the United States does business with them because they perceive them as being kind of very paternalistic, as being the father who's coming and showing up and giving a loan to their kids because they feel bad. It's a humanitarian case. China is investing in Africa because it's a good situation for them, China, but it's also they're trading with them as equals, and they're investing in the infrastructure of their country. So this just goes to show you the amount of financial assistance that China has been investing in Africa over the last decade or so. And you can see the different projects, the different loans, and for a variety of different things. Things like railway construction and agricultural development to oil exploration and sewage systems. It's all over the place, but they're providing those resources to ensure that they have better infrastructure, better institutions in these countries that might be experiencing rapid growth, like in Nigeria, like in Angola, like in South Africa, where you saw very strong economies, but maybe some, particularly in the case of Angola and Nigeria, questionable institutional strength. And this is another kind of, I think, really interesting element, which is that China has really done a lot to employ local workers. So rather than coming in and outsourcing everything to, workers back in, and, bringing in Chinese workers or bringing in American workers to Africa, they're actually training local African employees, and that helps obviously raise the average, GDP per person, the purchasing power per person, et cetera. These are really positive things. Will that continue? Honestly, it's too early to know. I'd like to think that it might. I'd like to think that the US can actually start taking some pages out of the Chinese book and implementing some of these strategies themselves. But it's interesting. It'll be very, very fascinating to watch how that develops. But obviously, the more you can get these companies or these outside countries to invest in, as I say here, hiring local managers, running apprentice and professional training programs. These are ways of getting middle class jobs. It's not just hiring a bunch of local people to do security around the premise or to be part of the janitorial staff. It's about getting them into project management, director level work, which is a gateway to middle class jobs, and that's a gateway to new economic opportunities for those countries. So how does that all kind of work out? That'll be kind of quite interesting to see. So what are some lessons to be learned? And I think this is a time to kind of step back and reflect a little bit. First, I think it's important to understand when we talk about these economic organizations like the World Bank, the IMF, the World Trade Organization, a lot of the growth that we've seen globally has actually taken part in 4 countries, as I list here. What we were commonly referred to, if you combine Russia, they're commonly referred to as the BRICS: Brazil, Russia, India, China, South Africa. I didn't include Russia here because their inclusion on this is kind of questionable sometimes. But in terms of changing the global economy, China, India, Brazil, South Africa has led to significant growth in purchasing power, per capita GDP, and reducing the amount of people in poverty. China and India alone have reversed those numbers. Now, they've done it through a pretty capitalistic system. Yes, China controls a lot of things. Okay, if you watched the video with Lee Bennett last week, you kind of got a sense of that a little bit. But India is very much so a free market economy and has really revolutionized economically their country in the last 20 to 30 years through that. So there is something to be said for free markets. It's not to say that, it's not to be critical of that. The question is, has the World Bank and the IMF actually contributed to this, or have these gains, would these gains have been made even without their existence? In other words, would these countries have single-handedly gotten themselves out of these situations without World Bank and IMF and WTO guidance? I don't know. I mean, that's a tough counter hypothetical. Maybe it's a little bit of a chicken and egg argument too. It's tough to know which came first, the international organizations or the growth. Okay, so I think that's kind of an interesting one to look at. The last point that's down here actually is something I've said in the past. A lot of these emerging economies are relying on ecotourism. And I mentioned here, and this is just to let full transparency, this particular slide is one that was left over from my presentation I gave last year to the class. And I thought to myself, this is still quite relevant. So I was going to leave it in for this year because it is so reliant on exogenous whims. Nobody is doing ecotourism right now. And that's what, when you look at Latin America, when you look at Africa, when you look at Southeast Asia, so many of these countries are basing their economies, and a huge chunk of their economies is ecotourism, Well, that just went up in flames. And I don't know when it's coming back. Maybe 6 months, maybe 12 months, maybe 18 months, maybe 24 months. But the bottom line is you're going to have a period of time where that part of your economy is gone. And now you're going to have the institutions and infrastructure in place to withstand that. Do you have unemployment insurance? Do you have federal work programs? Or do you have are you able to provide emergency loans to private companies? Are you able to subsidize and bail out the way the United States just has for small businesses? Are you able to do that? The United States is able to do that. Canada is able to do that. The United Kingdom is able to do that. Germany is able to do that. Is Nigeria able to do that? Is Costa Rica able to do that? Is Botswana able to do that? Is Kenya able to do that? Is Bangladesh capable of doing that? Cambodia? I don't know. And we won't know, I think, for a little while. So basing your economy off some of those, particularly something like the movement of people, like I said, whether it was something like this, which nobody could have foreseen the exact nature of this pandemic. I think people have for a long time have speculated about the pandemic, but the exact nature of it, you couldn't certainly isolate to this moment in time. Or if it's just a general recession and downturn through a housing market or through financial, peril, et cetera. These are factors that are going to have huge impact on something like ecotourism, more so because they're a luxury item. Those are things that get put away and pushed to the side first, right? When it comes time to, okay, how are we going to actually save money here? If a family's balancing a budget, somebody maybe just got furloughed for a couple of weeks. Maybe somebody lost their job. Maybe somebody's had their hours reduced. And you're looking at, okay, how are we going to make ends meet? The first thing that goes out the window is the family vacation, okay? Or any sort of, non-essential purchase. So those are the sorts of things that are very concerning, I think, moving forward. So some future roles. Listen, I think the big takeaway here is maybe the final bullet point, is that I think people have assumed that the IMF and the World Bank would be around for a really long time, but it's very possible that the global pandemic and economic crisis might have to fundamentally change the way in which we think about debt, the way we think about loan repayment, and global trade. That may force those organizations, I think they'll always be around, but it may force them to change their purpose. It may force them to change their actions in a substantive way that 6 months ago I didn't think was possible. In terms of debt forgiveness, debt repayment, loan restructuring, and the very essence of what these organizations are meant to do. So it's a very, exciting is maybe not the right word. My mom works in PR and she works for a Fortune 500 company. And they had to put out a press release about something. And somebody wrote in the first sentence, "We're excited to introduce." And my mom very quickly she scratched that out and she goes, "I don't think anybody is excited right now." And so she said, "I don't think that's a great word. You could say pleased, but we're not excited to introduce anything." So that is, so maybe excitement isn't the right word, but it's a fascinating element to be looking at. Okay, so wrapping up there, what do we got coming up? Got a few assignments. We got kind of a last push, and then we have the final exam. But that's not for another week or so after this. Okay, but the last push here of assignments, you have your international organization paper. That's due this coming Sunday, the 26th. Okay. You have a discussion thread on the global economy. That's a 2 to 3 minute video. You can just film yourself talking. You could even write out what you want to say and then just read it off a piece of paper. But I want you to get used to uploading a video to Canvas because of that next assignment that's on here, the policy presentation, 8 to 12 minutes. And I have the instructions for that up online as well. So those are the 3 big assignments coming up: the IO policy paper, discussion thread on the global economy, and finally the policy presentation. Course evaluations. Make sure to complete your course evaluations by May 1st. They're already open for my class, but professors are capable of editing the days that you have access to your course evaluations for that particular class. So when you get an email reminder, check the dates and make sure that you get your course evaluations completed before the end date, okay? For this class, it's May 1st, but for other classes, it may be sooner, or you may not even be able to start your course evaluations till next Monday, depending on the decision of the faculty member, okay? I've left it open for the whole 2 weeks, so you can go in, complete them anytime. I always welcome your feedback, love to hear your experience in the class, and so forth. Finally, UNESCO World Heritage Challenge. I'll have that posted later. And take a guess at this week's picture. There's no harm in trying. And also upload your own picture, okay? I have a feeling that there are a few of you out there who have pictures of UNESCO World Heritage sites and don't know it. And I'm just going to say, remember the Alamo. All right, that's my final word. I hope you all are doing well. Feel free to reach out to me if you have any questions. Look forward to talking to you later. Take care, one and all.